Buenos días, señores y señores.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you had a good rest, and I would like to thank the government of Canary Islands for the excellent dinner we had yesterday with nice music together. We enjoyed it, and we had a nice, interesting, and very interesting 2 sessions yesterday, institutional update on ICAO, and then we had a quite also interesting discussion on management of information. Today we are going to face 3 different sessions. I hope that they are interesting also to you. The first one is related to accident investigation, authorities, and the lessons learned. As I explained in the opening, this is the first hybrid exercise that we do in ICAO after the pandemic. And the hybrid, well, of course, requires all kinds of technical arrangements, and is working very well. By the way, thank you very much for all the support from the technical services in this auditorium. This is an experiment for ICAO and also for the Spanish Ministry of Transport. And we had tried the experiment so that even we could have not only virtual speakers, but virtual moderators. And today was the first time that we're going to have a virtual moderator. The virtual moderator was Steve Creamer. Steve Creamer is probably in Montreal, 3 o'clock in the morning, but it's not connected right now. So, as you can imagine, this is what happens with these hybrid exercises, but that will require that we do the moderation in a different way. But it doesn't mean that the session is not going to be as interesting as we thought. The accident investigation issue was mentioned yesterday several times, and for many reasons. Today, in this session 3, there an issue of protection of information, independence of the accident investigation commissions and arrangements, and then the relation of the accident investigation with the victims. I think that has 3 dimensions that they are really interesting. So, because I still don't have any sense that Steve Creamer is connected, my only duty today was to introduce Steve Creamer, but probably my duty will be extended. So I will introduce the panel. The panel is a remarkable panel. I'm sure we will have interesting exchanges. And the first to speak is Graham Braithwaite. I don't know him personally. I'm assuming that you're in the United Kingdom, in Cranfield, at this point of time. I don't have with me your CV. I know that you're a professor in Cranfield. You already have quite an experience in addressing, from an academic point of view and also from a consultant point of view, much experience on accident investigation. And with any further ado, please, Mr. Braithwaite, take the floor.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for this amazing privilege to speak on such an important topic. Safety is absolutely the #1 thing on which aviation is built. And yes, of course, you'd expect us to say that, but without safety, we just don't have an industry. And we've managed to build that reputation for safety, unfortunately, out of some very bad experiences. But actually, the most important thing is how we learn from those experiences, not just to come up with ways to prevent accidents, but also, as is so important during this conference, to make sure that those who are left behind are looked after properly. So thank you very much for this opportunity to speak. In terms of my background, I've spent the last 25 years working with accident investigators as they start their careers and develop their skills. So working with people from aviation, but also rail, marine, healthcare and other sectors who often look to aviation as being a source of leadership. And when we first meet people who are starting out on that career, then they have an idea of what accident investigation is. And our first job is to broaden their perception, really, to help them understand that this isn't just about finding the technical solution to an accident. It is also about making sure that we communicate in a very clear way with all the different stakeholders throughout the investigation and ultimately at the end of it. And it's built on trust. The whole thing is built on trust because we know that when a tragic event happens, then particularly in the first few hours and days, there is a lot of misinformation. We know the media try to do their best to relay an explanation of what has gone on, but actually in many cases it's done without access to the right information. And increasingly, and I know because as a university professor, we will often get approached to comment on something that's just happened. And we know that we will be encouraged to speculate about what this accident is and what might have happened and so on. And it can be incredibly damaging and it can be incredibly hurtful. And particularly for those anxious family members and colleagues, I think that can be an incredibly difficult time. So one of the things we have to try and convey to investigators is just what an important role they play in being the trusted source of information during an investigation. And if we think in really simple terms about what we're asking them to do, we're asking them to understand what happened in detail and then understand why it happened, because only then can we get to the most important bit, which we sometimes describe as the so what. So in other words, what will we do next? What will we do with this information? How will we make sure that the aviation system is safer? And in helping people to understand the breadth of that task, you have to help them understand the audiences and the full breadth of task. If you're a manufacturer, you want to understand how do we make sure that this doesn't happen again, or that we incorporate into design lessons learned. If you're an operator, you want to understand whether it might influence training or the way in which you're doing things. But if you're a family member, you may have a different set of questions that may be as simple but as fundamental and as important as, did my loved one suffer? And how do I stop somebody else going through the horrific experience that I'm going through? And actually, it can be very difficult to find investigators who can cover that full breadth, because you're looking often for somebody with a very deep technical specialism, but at the same time, you're looking for them to have the humanity and empathy to deal with people who may be bereaved or directly affected by an accident. And that might start very early on in terms of evidence collection, so some of the interviews that might take place, and in keeping people in touch with an investigation throughout. And at the end of the process, where sometimes investigation feels like it's characterized by a report, a two-dimensional thing, rather than somebody really explaining the implications or helping them to translate what can sometimes feel like a very technical document. I remember a few years ago talking to an investigator. He actually came from the railways, but he came through the same sort of training that we would give all of our investigators. And on his first investigation, he actually had to work with the families of two young girls who very sadly had been killed in an accident. And he would regularly brief the families. And he speaks of, actually with tears in his eyes as he spoke of it, that it was the hardest thing that he had ever had to do. And yet at the same time, the most rewarding thing he had ever done. To be the person that was trusted to give a clear, rational and objective explanation as to what had happened and what we were going to do about it. Actually, what made his job even harder was that one of the young girls had a sister. And the sister was a couple of years younger than her. So over the 2 years in which the investigation took place, he felt like he was briefing the victim, because she sat in front of him, and he said that held him to an extremely high standard to ensure that the work he did was accurate and that the recommendations that were made were going to be meaningful. But that brings me on to another point, which is that sometimes the investigation process feels tediously slow. I say this knowing that I work with airlines. I'm also responsible for the university's own flying operation. And when something goes wrong, The answer we want straight away is it safe to continue? And investigations can often take many months, in some cases years, to get to the right answer. So there will always be that tension between wanting to find out what has happened and an investigation process that sometimes can take quite a long time. So there's some expectation management required from the investigators there to ensure that people understand why it is they're not hearing answers. Recognizing that that void is often filled by yet more speculation. And sometimes it can feel incredibly frustrating that people are not hearing more from an investigation. But that's because the most important thing is that the investigators get it right, that it's accurate. And particularly in those first few days and weeks of an investigation, it is typical that there will be conflicting sources of evidence. Even with witness interviews, you will find, in fact, you must expect that witnesses will have seen and recalled different things. Anytime you know you really need to worry is when every witness says exactly the same thing, because that's just not the nature of things. So the investigator has that incredibly difficult job of trying to understand which of this evidence is accurate, which of it is in conflict, which is just a misremembering of what is a complex and incredibly challenging situation. Now, in yesterday's session, I saw a very interesting comment about making sure that everybody, in terms of family members and so on, receive the same level of treatment. And I thought it was really interesting in terms of making sure that there's a consistent high standard across the world. But at the same time, I think that sentence is in conflict, because actually every individual is different and their needs and their expectations are different. We say that one of the greatest challenges of accident investigation is that actually what you're asked to do is at zero notice and possibly not at a place that you know. And it involves working with a multinational, multidisciplinary team formed at very short notice. Well, you only need to look in the cabin of most airliners and you will see that the passengers and the crew that fly come from many different backgrounds, many nationalities and so on. And they all have some very different needs. I was fortunate enough a few years ago to supervise a PhD for a student who came from the Middle East. And he worked for a particular airline that had had an accident. And in that accident, there had been very many fatalities. And they really wanted to do the right thing by the family members. But they found it extremely difficult to do that, partly because the accident had happened in a very different part of the world, and that just the practice of responding to an accident was very different. The role of the legal system was very different, and they felt that they were kept very far away. But I remember one comment very closely, and that was that when they looked at the passenger list, they knew that some of their passengers had declared their religion to be different to the religion that they knew they actually had. So in wanting to do the right thing as an airline, they wanted to be culturally respectful. And at the same time, they also needed to recognize that they had been told different information than that they knew to be true. And it was just fascinating to see what a difficult job they had. They also described how in being trained to fly to certain parts of the world to show that they'd met their requirements in terms of family assistance, they were often told things that were culturally specific to one part of the world, without realizing that actually in some cases the opposite advice would be true for many of their passengers. So it is incredibly hard. And even at the end of the process, when it comes to briefing people ahead of a report being released, if it is likely to be negative towards particular individuals. So you know, we try very hard to make sure that if a crew member is about to be identified as somebody who's perhaps made an error, that the family are aware of that before it becomes public. That's really important. But actually, it can be quite hard to achieve the right level of understanding. Just one last comment. I remember a few years ago, after a helicopter accident that had happened in Glasgow, where a police helicopter ended up coming through the roof of a pub, and a number of people were killed in the aircraft on the ground. It was an incredibly difficult investigation because there wasn't a flight data recorder, there wasn't a voice recorder. And when the investigators eventually came to their final conclusion, they spent a lot of time with the families to explain what was in the report. I remember one of those bereaved family members speaking to the media straight after and saying that for the last 3 hours, he had been bamboozled, translate that, confused by all of this technical information from the investigators. And he looked genuinely upset by that. And yet knowing those investigators and having trained some of those investigators, I know how hard they tried to take a technical subject and try and explain it in simple terms to somebody. And it can be, as I say, incredibly challenging to do that. But I go back to that comment from the investigators some years ago. It may be the hardest thing that we ever ask somebody to do, but it may also be the most important thing we can possibly be, is the trusted source that helps people understand what happened, why did it happen, did my loved one suffer, and what will you, the aviation industry, do to stop it from happening again? Thank you very much.
Well, excellent. Thank you very much, Professor Braithwaite. You have touched upon a number of issues, but starting with trust. And trust, we mentioned yesterday how important it was to have information that is available in a quick fashion. And you mentioned the slow process of investigation, and that derives to speculations all over. Yesterday we mentioned that information should be validated, and of course from an accident investigation body, of course, is validated. And the question is, does information should come from a credible authority, a credible body, not anybody, but a credible body. You have touched the relations with the families, and we will come back to this issue in the debate if necessary. As you see, I am retaining my extra job of moderating this exercise while we get in contact with Steve Kramer. So I will continue with the next speaker, and that is Jennifer Homedy, Honorable Jennifer Homedy. She's the chairperson of the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB of the US. We had already some remarks about NTSB yesterday by Elias. We know how NTSB is a reference for a long time already in the relations with families and victims. And we are very happy to have the chairperson with us today, probably from Washington. This time our virtual connection works. So thank you for joining. Madame Homedy, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. And I want to begin by thanking ICAO for organizing such an important event, and Spain's Ministry of Transport and the regional government of Gran Canaria for hosting. When I came to the NTSB in 2018, I gave a speech at a pipeline conference, and a father I had worked with for a number of years who had lost his stepson in a terrible pipeline explosion in Bellingham, Washington, spoke with me about everything our family assistance program did for his family following the tragedy. And he said he remembered 20 years later everything that the family assistance team had done, and that he never forgot that. So I don't know if you have my slides there. We can go through the slides. Well, I'll just continue. So I'm proud that the NTSB has an entire division, and you can go to the next slide. Slide after this one. Yep, thank you. So I'm proud that the NTSB has an entire division and specialists that are dedicated to carrying out the agency's family assistance program and operations. We have 6 staff, and 2 more are coming on soon. Yesterday, Elias Quintanas, who serves as our chief of our Transportation Disaster Assistance Program, walked through the various pieces of legislation that developed the program, one of which I helped draft when I worked in the U.S. House of Representatives. But as he mentioned, there are some unique aspects to our program, and I just want to mention a few before I get into some of the challenges and lessons learned. Our program prioritizes equitable care and treatment, meaning we provide family assistance without regard to the mode of transportation. So whether it's an aviation accident, a school bus crash, a train derailment, a gas pipeline rupture, or a boat fire and sinking, the same level of care and treatment is provided to all those impacted by that tragedy. That includes crew members, passengers, ground personnel, and others who may have been impacted by an event. Also, just to point out, there's no definition of family in our legislation, so we take an all-inclusive approach to what it means to be a family member. So if a close friend considers them a family member, themselves a family member, they get the same information in family member meetings as others. Next slide. Over the past 25 years of direct engagement in family assistance operations, the NTSB has continued to refine its family assistance program to meet current and future challenges. Obviously, COVID provided some opportunities and challenges in how we work with families. The NTSB leveraged multiple communication technologies to increase our engagement with family members. And these technologies made it easier to connect with families. They removed logistic and financial barriers often associated with in-person meetings and allowed families to participate in a physical environment of their choosing. But using technology presents challenges. It tends to feel more impersonal and disconnected. It's difficult to assess emotions and reactions. There are often distractions, and there are also risks. We always work to ensure that only invited participants can access the meeting. How do you ensure that in a virtual environment, especially when some may have their cameras off? And it's also difficult to prevent recording. Next slide. Essential to the success of a transportation disaster family assistance program is an independent and transparent safety investigation. In fact, transparency is one of our agency's core values. But as we all know, and as Graham said, the first few days of an investigation is just the beginning of a long process. The quality of information is questionable early on. This is especially true with social media, which provides its own unique challenges. We often explain that on scene, our investigators are hard at work collecting the perishable evidence. Much of the additional fact-finding and certainly the analysis comes much later. But understandably, the survivors and the families and the public, including the media, want as much information as they can get quickly. But it's critical to our investigation and to the credibility of our agency and the findings and recommendations that are developed as a result of our investigation, that information is accurate and as refined as possible. Also, our goal is to brief the survivors and family members before we announce anything to the media. This is a very challenging goal to achieve, especially early in the response, since it may take some time to obtain contact information for family members and establish communications. Next slide. Our family assistance program was originally designed around the concept of all fatal accidents, with the Family Assistance Center as the focus of the operation. Through time, the program has responded to an increasing number of mass casualty incidents, which has required adjustments to our program. In those situations, survivors may be transported to multiple hospitals or may leave the scene of an accident immediately and travel home. This makes it difficult to ensure survivors are reunited with family members and that information and resources are provided to survivors if we can't locate them or get a hold of them in some way. So the key lesson here is to ensure that your family assistance program is flexible and nimble, always striving to improve and always working to enhance the provision of services to those affected. Next slide. Over the past 25 years, we've seen family assistance programs mature among domestic and foreign air carriers, which is great. But we're also seeing a significant increase in turnover of air carrier emergency management staff, which has resulted in a loss of historical knowledge and lack of operational experience. Also, I know there was significant discussion yesterday about the important role of airports in family assistance operations. As Elias mentioned, airports have no legal family assistance obligations in the United States, but they are very involved. Many include family assistance in their emergency response plans and have established emergency response working groups. Also, the Transportation Research Board, which is part of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, has published operational guidance for airports focused on family assistance. Next slide, please. In order to do family assistance right, it takes collaboration with partner organizations. The NTSB invests considerable time and resources and effort in developing and maintaining relationships before an accident occurs, so that when one does occur, a partnership has already been formed. Over the past decade, the NTSB has organized and participated in over 40 training programs annually. The objectives of these programs is to promote a better understanding of family assistance and encourage our colleagues to share challenges faced, lessons learned, and best practices implemented following accident responses. The goal is for participants to come away with tangible best practices they can use to develop or enhance their respective family assistance programs. It's also important for them to appreciate that they aren't alone in this effort and that we can collaborate to enhance our respective understanding of family assistance. Next slide, please. And just on this slide, this one shows that COVID has had a significant impact on our outreach program. We saw a significant decline of engagement in 2020 with a pivot towards the virtual engagement. And we've seen, thankfully, a resurgence of interest in 2021 and expect our outreach program to return to pre-COVID engagement levels in 2022. Next slide, please. So lessons learned. Essential to the success of a transportation accident family assistance program is an independent and transparent safety investigation with a focus on ensuring safety and not assigning blame or liability. A well-designed family assistance plan should be flexible and scalable with a clearly identified lead agency that utilizes a unified command concept of operations, enabling organizations to work together without acquiescing authority, responsibility, or accountability. And it's really important to have one coordinated voice, especially when speaking with survivors, family members, and the public. I enjoyed the remarks yesterday from Jill Sparrow with Emirates Airline. I thought she was right on point with that discussion. Family assistance should be an organizational priority ingrained in the culture and mindset of the organization. It is so much more than a set of regulations, standard operating procedures, or checklists. It's about listening and learning from the experiences of those impacted by a disaster. And fundamentally, it's about caring for others, treating them with the care and compassion that we would expect if we were facing the unexpected injury or loss of a loved one. And next slide. A comprehensive family assistance response requires a collaborative effort from multiple government agencies and non-governmental organizations. Family assistance is about establishing rapport and credibility with family members by communicating realistic expectations about the investigation and other aspects of the response. And it's important to point out that for the NTSB, engagement with family members doesn't end at the conclusion of the investigation. That's really only the first step for us. Many family members are interested in advocacy work afterwards and working with us to get our recommendations implemented. So we continue to work with family members. And again, I highlight the need to show empathy, to engage with family members, to listen and learn from their experiences, and then apply what you learn to enhance your programs. And finally, my next slide, please. This shows how to connect with us at the NTSB. And so happy to answer any questions when we get to that. Thank you so much for having us.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Halmedi. Very interesting reflection on the experiences that NTSB is having and the experience that you have accumulated in this field. You have touched upon a number of issues that hopefully we can elaborate a little bit later. Now, let me go to the next speaker. This is Remy Judy. This is the chairman of the European Network of Civil Aviation Safety Investigation Authorities, ENCASIA, and responsible for accident investigations in France. So, Mr. Judy, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to this symposium on assistance to families and to this session on accident investigation. Before entering the subject of the relation between the accident investigation and the assistance to families, I think it is useful to recall the purpose of the safety investigation and the main principles of the safety investigation process. Annex 13 well-known statement is shown here. The sole objective of the investigation of an accident or incident shall be the prevention of accident and incident. And it is not the purpose of this activity to apportion blame or liability. So it seems clear and simple, but it seems it is sometimes forgotten, or sometimes other objectives seem to be expected from the safety investigation, and I would like to touch on that. The European regulation on accident investigation takes on board this sole objective with a slightly different wording, but clearly the same meaning. It also introduces the idea of improving the quality of accident investigations in Europe and of the European network of civil aviation safety investigation authorities helping into that, but I'll come back on that later. What are the main principles of the safety investigation process which are enshrined in the Annex 13 and in the EU regulation, which are necessary for achieving this overall objective? A first principle, which I call the principle of neutrality, is well known. It is that the safety investigation and that the safety investigation authority must be independent from any authority which could any entity, which could interfere with the conduct and the objectivity of the investigation. Obviously, this is for the purpose of finding the cause and contributing factors in the most objective and balanced way, and for the purpose of drawing appropriate safety lessons. It must also be separate from any judicial investigation, and this is obviously for the purpose of not apportioning blame or liability. A second principle is what I would call a principle of technical credibility. For the safety lessons and recommendations to be accepted and implemented, the analysis of the investigations evidences gathered during the investigation must be technically correct, and this necessitates the safety investigation has access to relevant technical data and expertise. This usually cannot be achieved solely by the investigators of the authority in charge. And this is why Annex 13 and the EU regulation foresees the participation of other entities, such as the aircraft operator and the manufacturer, eventually through the accredited representative of the state of those entities. Now, one could object that bringing those entities into the safety investigation process could affect the principle of independence and neutrality, since those same entities may have interests to defend beyond the objective of improving safety. I would like to say this objection is correct. And this is why Annex 13 and the EU regulation have defined and limited the role of those entities may have in the process in order to preserve this principle of independence, while still affording access to pertinent technical information and expertise. A third principle is sometimes called the just culture principle. In order to avoid that information remains hidden, people must be reassured that appropriate use is going to be made of the collected information, and that only the data and information that is strictly necessary to support the conclusion of the investigation report is going to be publicly released. This has led to the notion of sensitive information, which includes in particular the content of flight recorders and witnesses' statement and draft documents, draft reports, etc. Those data and information cannot be shared outside of the safety investigation and should not be used for other purposes than the safety investigation. As a final point on the means to achieve the objective of improving safety, the result and conclusion of the safety investigation as disseminated through public reports. And I would like to note also that those reports generally recall in their preamble that the report is released for the sole purpose of improving safety and that it is not expected to be used for other purposes such as apportioning blame and liability. Now some words about the role of ENCASIA in the investigation process in Europe. I need first to make clear that accident investigation in Europe remain the responsibility of each national safety investigation authority of the state of occurrence. And that ENCASIA, to respect the principle of independence, cannot interfere in the investigations conducted by its members. However, the main objective of ENCASIA is to further improve the quality of the safety investigation conducted by its members, and several activities shown on this slide concur to this objective. In order to save time, I am not going to go in detail on all those activities, but this include in particular training, peer reviews, and sharing of good and best practices, and so on. Now, in all what I have exposed up to now, it appears that the safety investigation process is independent and separate from the family assistance. This is true, and this is affirmed by ICAO in its guideline on family assistance. One could draw the conclusion that there is no place for interaction with families in the accident investigation process. Then this is not totally true, because the safety investigation cannot ignore what is sometimes called the social context of investigation. I have reproduced here and on the next slide some quotes of representatives of family association. We have seen similar quotes also in the presentation yesterday. All this confirms that the flow of information and comments, whether true or false, after an event is disturbing for families, and there is a need for families to receive validated information they can trust. It also confirms that the judicial proceeding, the search for responsibility, the issue of liabilities, may be important for families, or for some of them at least, and that it may be difficult for them to make the difference, as we investigators do, between the safety investigation whose sole objective is improving aviation safety and other proceedings aiming at assigning blame or liability. Now, when it comes to information sharing with the families and with the public, indeed, the early dissemination of rumors, unvalidated information, self-appointed experts by media is confusing for everybody, and first of all, confusing for the families. Social media increase the speed at which information or rumor may circulate and make it even more difficult to distinguish true information from fake news. So there is a need for safety investigation in order to establish its credibility, to communicate early on whatever validated information is available, or to dismiss fake news or unconfirmed scenarios. And it is clear that families should have a priority in receiving such information, even though in the early hours or days after an accident, there may be practical difficulties to establish a direct communication with families. This is where emergency plans and early coordination with the person in charge of activating those plans may help in setting up as early as possible a structured communication channel with families and their associations. Now, the need to inform families on the progress of investigation is recognized by ICAO Annex 13, and even more so by the European regulation, which requires that safety investigation authorities disseminate information to families before making that same information public. Now, what can ENCASIA do to facilitate or improve information to families? ENCASIA is an appropriate forum to share experience and to provide general training. However, again, giving information to families on a given investigation remains the responsibility of the safety investigation authority in charge of that state. ENCASIA cannot intervene in the investigations conducted by its members. So here is a short list of European action on assistance to families in the past years, including communication and information to families. When I look at the record of those events, I noted with interest that on one hand, most of the concepts and principles which have been discussed yesterday and today have been already exposed in the past. On the other hand, when I look at the experience on the major accidents of the 1990s or early 20s, it shows that it was a learning phase and that these principles were progressively implemented. And clearly, the way families have been considered in some accidents from those years would not be considered acceptable by anybody today. So I believe we have made some progress on this. So to close this information, just a small example of an ENCASIA action on information to families. A small leaflet has been prepared to present the accident investigation process and the interactions they may expect from the accident investigation authority. This leaflet is available in all 23 EU languages, thanks to the support of the European Commission, and is on the ENCASIA website. And it may be used by the accident investigation authorities and more widely by the crisis management authorities to help them in their communication for families. With that, I thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Judy. Again, this comes from a European perspective, so it's very good to have both sides, the American perspective and the European perspective. Then we will have some other experiences. You mentioned a number of principles. Principles that they are very easy to understand, but difficult to define. When we say independence, what is independence? How far can we go in the independence? And what is independence in one state, and what is independence in some other states? So we will, again, hopefully have some time to discuss all this. You mentioned also that we made some progress. Indeed, the issues are the same from the very beginning, but hopefully we are progressing in addressing this matter. So thank you very much. We will go to the next speaker. The next speaker is Maud Faud Saruhi, and this is the former crisis director in Malaysia Airlines of the two accidents that they had, the MH370 and the MH17. I hope that you are online, probably from Malaysia.
Yes, I'm online. Can everyone hear me clearly?
Okay, go ahead, please.
Good morning, everyone in Spain, in Canary Islands, and greetings from Malaysia. My name is Fuad Sharuji, and I was the former crisis director of MH370 and MH17, the two major tragedies that we had. And in that year, we lost 537 lives, all in all. And in dealing with the two tragedies, I'm going to share with you the issues that we had, not only on the investigation, but more on the family assistance, as well as the other issues relating to both the accidents. First of all, I would like to share with you that, give you the brief summary of the two accidents that we had in 2014, in March 2014, 8th of March to be specific, with our flight to Beijing with 239 passengers and crew. The aircraft disappeared 1 hour after it departed Kuala Lumpur, and the aircraft is still missing until today. And this is what is one of the world's mystery, aviation mystery in the world history of aviation that I can say now, that until today, we do not know exactly where the aircraft is, even though there were debris collected from the shores of South Africa. But until today, exactly, we do not know where the aircraft and why it happened, and so on. So this is perhaps one of the biggest issues that we had until today. We are still dealing with the family members, the 227 passengers and 12 crew members that we are dealing with. And in total, we are actually still maintaining our communication with more than 2,000 families until today for both these two tragedies. And for MH17, it is a different kind of accident altogether. The flight from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur in July 2014, just about 4 months apart after MH370, we had another tragedy on MH17, the flight from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur. The aircraft flew over Ukraine and it was shot down in Ukraine, and all 298 passengers and crew perished. Whilst MH17 is more grotesque, and all the bodies were basically, almost all the bodies were found, except for two until today. Out of the 298, 296 were found. Two are still missing until today. So, but some of the bodies are remains. The remains of the bodies are not bodies, but they're just merely body parts, and some of them are completely burned. So it's really, really bad, and it's very, very difficult for the families. So, having to deal with the families of these two tragedies, it's not an easy task at all. Because as far as we're concerned, I'll talk about MH370 first. During the early phase of MH370, we had to deal with the search phase, where the search and rescue mission was conducted with several participation from various countries, including Malaysia. The initial focus was in South China Sea, and then the search moved to the west coast, went towards Andaman, and then later, on the third day, that we were told that the aircraft actually went down, and it continued the flight, and about 1 week later, then was confirmed that the aircraft went down and the flight ended somewhere on the 7th arc of South Indian Ocean. So, which until today we do not know exactly where. The search mission has been covered over a period of over an area of about 227,000 square kilometers in South Indian Ocean along the 7th arc, but they couldn't find MH370 at all. So until today, we are dealing with a loss what we call as ambiguous loss for the families, and which is not easy because we have to, the trauma that the families have to deal with, the uncertainties, and they cannot find any closure with MH370. So that makes it very, very difficult for the families. So whereas for MH17 is different, the kind of trauma with MH17 is very different because the bodies and remains were repatriated. We actually brought the families over from wherever they were. Back when we flew them to Amsterdam, we reunited them with loved ones, of course, in coffins and in caskets. And we brought all the remains back home to their respective homes, and we assisted them with the funeral arrangements until the end. So we had to deal with a lot of issues, not only on the investigation part, but on the softer issues as well. On the, for example, I just give you an example, like, if the remains were really, you have pieces of body parts that are completely charred and completely burned. And we keep all of them in a full-size coffin, casket, and they are all sealed and repatriated. When we repatriated them, the family members demand, they want to see the remains of their loved ones for the very last time. And we were quite perplexed under that situation, and in spite, we are in a quandary that we are not sure whether we should allow or we shouldn't allow. But under a lot of pressure from the families, we decided to give in and allow them to view at their own risk. And some of them took it quite well, and some of them took it very, very negatively. And they had post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. So with regards to investigation, one of the family's basic needs is actually to get information. Like Graham said earlier, is that what they want to know is what really happened, why the accident happened. These are the two basic things that they need to know. They need to know, and they want to know all the facts pertaining to that accident, why it happened. And as an operator of the airline, that we cannot get involved with the investigation, but we provide all the information that's required by the authorities, by the AAIB. So, so since they cannot get this information from the families, they can't get the information from the authorities, they can't get it from us. We have to try to work hand in hand with the authorities to provide some information to the families, at least to tell them what we know and also what we do not know. And this is very important. At least we tell them that there are a lot of things that we do not know, especially so for MH370. And there are a lot of things that we do not know. And as you know that the investigation for MH370, the safety investigation, it took 4 years to finally conclude the safety investigation. And even then, the final investigation was inconclusive. Inconclusive mainly because the wreckage couldn't be found, the bodies couldn't be found, you couldn't find the DFDR or the CVR, and therefore we cannot provide any conclusive evidence or justifications to make a conclusion. So, and this is a big, huge disappointment for the families. So these are amongst the issues that we have with regards to sharing of information. So what the families did was they had to turn to social media and the mainstream media. So they talked to the media and tried to get information. And the problem is that we do not know whether the information from the media is true or false or fake or false. You know? And in many cases, the authorities did not comment on any of the statements that were made by the mainstream or the social media. they prefer not to comment and want to play safe. And because of that, that puts us in a very difficult situation. So, and especially when the investigation works that are being viral by the mainstream media, I can give you quite a number of examples on that. And then in addition to that, we also have independent investigators who did their own investigation and they publish their works, investigation works, in the mainstream or social media. And we have examples like the latest one, which is very new, just a few days ago. Mr. Richard Godfrey produced a report of the investigation, independent investigation. And then we also have a company called the Seventh Capricorn that actually did another investigation and they broadcasted it and they made reports out of it. And there are also documentaries from the mainstream media like the Fox News, the ABC, CNN included, so, and BBC. So, and this makes it very difficult because some of the news that were given or issued released by the media may or may not be accurate, and some already formed their own conclusion. So, so ladies and gentlemen, that I just want to share with you that from an airline's perspective, when we deal with the families, we have to deal right through, right from the beginning until the end. So today, right now, we are on already 7.5 years past MH370 tragedy. I'm still in communication with all the NOKs, especially the Chinese NOKs. And something that we learned about family assistance in our family assistance program, one of the things that we took for granted that we treat all of them the same, but that is not really true because what we learn is that we have to treat all the families fairly, but not necessarily equally. And that is important because of the disparity in the belief system, in the religion, in the cultural aspects, is very, very different. As an example that I can share with you, in our dealings with the Chinese families of MH370, our dealings with them is very, very difficult because they are highly emotional, very emotional, and they gather in groups, in big groups. And as compared to MH17, where majority of them are Dutch, out of 298 passengers and crew on MH17, 192 are Dutch. And they are the way that they grieve is very different. We offered 3 hotels in Amsterdam for our family assistance center, Steinberger Hotel being the main hotel. We, in our family assistance policy, we accommodate about 4 family members to 1 victim. So we prepared actually rooms in rooms that in 3 different hotels that can accommodate up to 800 families for MH17. But for MH370, we prepared, there were 200, out of 227 passengers, 153 were Chinese. So we prepared room for 600 families, but the number of families that showed up in the hotels in Beijing was in excess of 1,500. It's a lot more than what we expected. And when we prepared the same number of rooms in Amsterdam for the MH17 Dutch families, and we were again very surprised that out of the 800 rooms that we prepared, only 40 families came and requested to take up the rooms. So the rest were not.
Mr. Saruhi,
Differences, yeah?
Mr. Saruhi,
yes.
I think we need to conclude. We need to conclude. Thank you. Please.
Thank you.
Well, I don't want to stop you, but I just want to go to the end. Any further reflections from your side? Probably not. Okay. I appreciate very much the experience of and testimony of Mr. Saruhi. Those accidents, MH370 and MH17, I always refer that as not a typical accident, yeah, something else, very traumatic. To refer that an airplane has disappeared, that has been missed, that is missing, that today it is still missing, and it still is a mystery, is something shocking. I remember saying the same thing in the Council of ICAO a long time ago. How in the 21st century we can have an aircraft that is missing. I know that in ICAO we have taken some actions in this regard so that this should not happen again, but this is not the topic of today. So thank you very much, Mr. Saruhi, for that testimony that comes from an airline trying to interface with the victims, but relying on the information that should come from the authorities. And this is the issue. I mean, you have to go to the source of that information and to the validation of that source. So let's go and continue. Now, the next speaker is Pamela Suarez. Pamela is the former president of the regional group of aero accident investigation in Latin America. And this brings another dimension to the issue. Is every single state has the capability of doing all this with all these principles and these common and accepted practices? Well, Pamela, you have the floor.
Thank you. El aparatito.
You have the laser pointer somewhere?
Bueno.
So, good morning, everybody. Firstly, I'd just like to thank the ICAO, the Spanish Ministry for Transport, and the regional and island authorities, and a special mention to the Association of Air Crash Victims and their families, and particularly their president, Pilar Herrero, who was really the person who sparked my awareness of the importance of the role of the victims. So I was in charge of the experience here in Argentina over recent years, and I'm going to talk about a number of accidents that really have shaped the way we work and the way that we have taken on the importance in terms of carrying out the investigations, as we've heard, and also the importance of the role of the victims. And we've had the first stories of the commissions of investigation from 1954. In 2010, we decided to move forward. We knew that the government decided to take on the role of the investigator as part of the state security defense, and through Decree 1193 set up an independent air accident investigation board that has its own legal structure and its own financial autonomy. And here we have in 2011, we have the tragedy of Flight 5428, and that's really when this decree took on life. And so, you know, we can see the deficiencies that we saw in the aftermath of this accident. That's what really brought home to the government how important it was to have this independent authority. So in 2012, we approached ICAO and we signed a technical agreement to be able to set up this body under international standards. So this body was the naming of the first president of the Civil Aviation Accident Investigation Board. This is when it really came on board. And this has now become the Board of Transport Safety and Security. Well, it was really difficult to set up this independent, reliable body. We set up a really clear action plan with 3 basic axes. We needed, obviously, internal consolidation. It needed to be training, professionalization, structure, and equipment. We also identified that we needed to change the investigation model, because the existing model was linear, and we needed to introduce a systemic model so that we would be actually acting across right across the aeronautic system. And we needed to open it up to the community. Although it was a state security plan, but we needed to open it all up and have a culture of closeness to other bodies rather than being a closed select body that only talked to one another. It was a huge amount of teamwork with the support of all our international peers. Argentina is quite a small country, so it really needed to draw on international experience, and we started to get the initial results. And we started carrying out more professional investigations, and we were able to set up the Management Quality Committee, which is a group of experts that ensure that all the investigations do not lose sight of the systemic approach and that everything is entirely traceable. We included, as we've been hearing, it's so difficult to maintain the independence, so we set up this part system so that all the necessary information will be available in a transparent way to be able to carry out more in-depth investigations, because that's really the objective we'd marked ourselves. We also started to upload our data in the same language, so we were all using the same language, standardizing our data collection. And so we created our database so that we weren't just based on, one-off accidents. We could look at the common factors. And we started to look at safety and security programs that covered the whole process. So we stopped being reactive and we took on a proactive vision, and we incorporated these safety alerts. And we then started to produce safety recommendations, because that's a basic part of the whole system. Not just, issuing recommendations, but also carrying out follow-up. This has been in place since 2015, and we started having a 5% response rate of the system to begin with, and it's now up to an 80% response rate. At the same time, we also were committed with other partners across Latin America, and we started to promote this regional cooperation mechanism of South America that looks to standardize these processes of investigation and to generate common databases to cover the whole of Latin America. However, this was insufficient. We'd worked massively, but in 2015, we realized that we had a major gap. We hadn't underscored our role in terms of assistance to victims and families. And this really came home in the 2015 helicopter collision with 12 fatalities, several of which were French citizens, and we had former Olympic champions there. And this really brought home the fact that, we'd become really professional, everything was technically working really well, but we had not taken into consideration this assistance to the victims and their families. And so we drew up the first protocol to cover this, we created a specific area to assist victims and their families, and we started to learn a huge amount about our own attitudes. You know, when we came out of the technical investigation box, and then what kind of information did the victims need? It wasn't just raw data, but they also needed professionalism, and we started to introduce protocols to take care of the personal effects, everything that was related to the victims and their presence, and to take great care of the information that was passed on to the media, to ensure that nobody would find out anything in the media before being told directly by us. And what we've been able to do is to assist 42 different families from 21 fatal accidents. And so we carry out this work to be able to take care of all citizens across the whole country, to be able to improve the systems, to see what are the real needs on the side of the families and the victims. What information do they need to get, and from a reliable source? Not just families of victims in Argentina, but also from, you know, right across the world. So in 2019, we played an active role in the investigation and to help in this air crash where Emiliano Sala's family needed assistance. And so that really helped us to hone our skills in this area. So from all this experience in Argentina, we can ensure that the investigation's independence and the follow-up of the different recommendations are absolutely key to be able to carry out our mission, which is to promote security. But we need to go beyond that. We need to adopt our role with the victims, the families of the victims, and we know that it's up to us. We need to take on this commitment. And so our commitment covers the whole of the aeronautic system, including the families of the victims. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Pamela, for sharing the Argentinian experience. And we know that you continue to broaden the fields that you work in. We'll now move on to the next speaker, Carna Almenteri. Who comes to us from the Air Accident Investigations, the Civil Aviation Administration. I think you're probably in Dubai.
Greeting, ladies and gentlemen, from Abu Dhabi.
Abu Dhabi, excellent. So please go ahead.
Greeting, ladies and gentlemen. It's a special day today, the 2nd of December, as we are celebrating the United Arab Emirates' 50th National Day. And on behalf of the United Arab Emirates, I would like to express my thanks and for the invitation and the great opportunities to participate at such important symposium. I'm Khazina Al-Mundari, and it's an honor to be here and to present some of the lessons learned by air accident investigation sector. Introduction of the family assistance plan around the world over the 20 years has to ensure that the relatives of the victims of aircraft accident are provided with a humanitarian and practical support during a very difficult time. And the family members find the assistance provided by the airlines to be helpful in addressing their immediate practical and medical needs. Can we go to the next slide, please? Next. As you know, the UAE aviation sector is among the youngest around the world and has 6 national air operators and 8 international airports. And the provision of the family assistance is seen as essential by aviation industry. So referring to ICAO document 9973, the aim of the family assistant is to provide or to address the concern and needs of the needs of the victims and their families. And from that one, in 2015, the UAE air accident investigation sector decided to introduce the family assistance plan regulation and to ensure that we have a common standard among all air operators. So in December 2017, we have issued the Aviation Disaster Family Assistance Plan Regulation, and the GCA, which is the General Civil Aviation Authority, was in the position to make the UAE that has a world-class family assistance program. Next slide, please. The objective was for the regulation is to reaffirm the commitment of the United Arab Emirates that to provide adequate and sufficient support for the victims and their families. So the first objective was to establish the regulatory requirement, integrate the family assistance plan of the air operators and airports with a national level plan for effective coordination and to have control for the efforts. Oversight through the regular assessment, and I will go through it more details in the lesson learned, readiness and primitiveness to address different scenarios. Next, please. Okay. For the National Family Assistance Plan, UAE Aviation Disaster Management System includes many responsibilities, starting with National Crisis and Emergency Management Authority, which is NCEMA. So any issues or any in the event of the crisis or emergency or disaster, the first authority who's responsible about that is NCEMA. Then we have the regulatory bodies, which is the General Civil Aviation Authority, Air Accident Investigation. We have an air operators, we have airports and government entities and semi-government entities, and including the volunteers and private sectors. Next slide, please. So, during establishing phase of the family or aviation disaster family assistance plan, we had notices that the consultation with the industry, especially the air operators and airports and the public, was very valuable, and it's important because we cannot see the full picture unless we get more views and perspectives. And from that one, we had identified gaps, and that helped us also to prevent any future disaster. As the GCA or the General Civil Aviation Authority include one of the requirements that we have to share and to consult any regulatory requirement before we publish it. We have to share it with the air operators and the airports before publishing any regulatory requirements. The reason was that to prevent any future disaster, also to exchange knowledge and experience. The second thing was the well-being strategy. United Arab Emirates has issued a well-being strategy for 2031 for ensuring that we have a high quality society. So the regulation has to be in line with this strategy by ensuring that the family members have provided with sufficient support. The continuous improvement of the regulation. We are working in many areas now in the regulation. The next issue will be by the next year, and we are making sure that we will include the emerging issues such as the pandemic, COVID-19, that wasn't included, and with different scenarios that may occur during the aviation disaster. Next, please. Oversight. During the period 2019 to 2020, the GCA carried out a family assistance assessment program in 4 air operators, which is Etihad, Emirates, Fly Dubai, and Air Arabia. The reason was for this assessment is to measure the compliance with the regulation, to measure the effectiveness of the regulation, also to share knowledge and experience. There was no findings, it was only observation and recommendations shared with the air operators for improvement. And we had notices that the current regulation does not include the frequency of these programs and also the procedure for how we accept of the air operators and airports plans. Also the frequency of the exercise. Now we are discussing with the government entities and semi-governments how we can provide a joint exercise at national level. So that we need to include it in the next issue of the regulation. Next, please. And the last area, which is the implementation, we have some little gaps in the information that relevant to the applicability, activation of the plan, who's the National Family Assistance Coordinator, and how we link between the UAE Aviation Disaster Family Assistance Plan and the UAE National Emergency Response Plan, because that should be at the national level. And it's very important to clarify this information, as many people, they were asking, not just the people, not the public, it's also the air operators and airport operators. So the activation, currently it's mentioned in the regulations that by the General Civil Aviation Authority Air Accident Investigation on consultation with ANSIMA, the National Crisis Authority. However, that one need to be more clarified in the next issue to avoid any or to prevent any gaps in the information that we provided. Next, please. Yeah. Just to conclude my presentation, the air accident investigation in the UAE is try to ensure that we are providing adequate and sufficient support for the families and for the victims and their families, and also to support the air operators and airport operators for effective implementation of the plan. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Al-Manteri.
Muchas gracias, señora.
Experience in the Emirates. And this has concluded the different presentations. Let's try if we can address a couple questions. I don't know if you have any question coming from the floor, but there are plenty of issues. And if we don't touch some of the issues, I am looking forward to the session number 5 to pick up some issues that are still pending in the discussion and to elaborate on that. If you don't have questions from the floor, yes, I was going to raise my own question, but I see Andrew O'Halley, representative of the United Kingdom in the Council of ICAO. Please, go ahead.
Thank you, Victor. And as this is the first time I've spoken, please allow me to pass my gratitude to the authorities of Spain and the Canary Islands for hosting this important event. I'd also like to pass my thanks to Madam Pilar Vera and the other representatives of the family associations for sharing their experiences with us, which is absolutely essential for us to do better. On this round table, thank you also to all the participants. It's clear that a lot of good work is taking place both domestically and also regionally in terms of improving capability. My question is basically what more can be done laterally to improve capability, whether at a regional level or a global level. We're looking at having this new global standard come into force next year. So how can we actually improve the capability of states to actually deliver that? My second question relates to capacity. One of the key concerns, of course, is that when you're faced with such a huge crisis, you're having to ramp up capacity to deal with it incredibly quickly. Can anything be done laterally between countries to actually help improve capacity to respond? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. I don't know who would like to address that question. Is the action laterally? How can we increase capacity? How do you respond as your organization towards such probably a disaster of great dimensions? Do you have your resources in hand? And if you don't have it, how do you extend that effort laterally? Can I ask probably NTSB first, Madame Hamedi, would you like to say something about it? You mentioned you have a small team. I thought it was like 6 or 7 related to this exercise, but a big disaster, of course, will be overwhelming to 6 people. How do you deal with this situation? Madame Hamedi, please.
Well, you know, we do have 6 people right now, and it will be 8 people soon, but the NTSB works with our partners. That's why it's so important, I think, you know, with our training program that our transportation disaster assistance team provides. We proactively throughout the year engage with whether it's emergency management teams of air carriers or other transportation carriers or states or localities to provide training in advance, as well as other agencies, so that when something does happen, that that collaboration has already occurred and there is a partnership, and people know what to expect on the ground when we get there. And that's key, to have that relationship in advance. I will say, from country to country, in response to the question, we don't just do training inside, you know, the United States. We do training internationally as well, and have had numerous engagements with other countries to help provide assistance in their family assistance endeavors, and happy to do that in any way we can. But I think overall, ensuring there's increased engagement among partners before something occurs to make sure that when something does occur, that everybody's prepared.
Okay, thank you very much. But can I go beyond that, saying, because I think the question goes beyond the limits of a state. Can we address this from a global perspective, relations with other organizations beyond your own state? Is this required or not, especially when there are, of course, victims from other countries? Can we do something about it? again, excuse me to go back to you, Madam Hamadi.
Yeah, and no, as I was mentioning, our engagement isn't just in the United States. We work with other countries as well. And so, you know, I think that sharing of information, lessons learned, just like we're having here, but then also preparing together for a potential accident to occur, I think is critical.
Okay, thank you very much. Pamela, you wanted to say something about it?
Gracias.
Yes, this is something that, you know, it's really relevant for all these small organizations such as ours. We know that the coordination mechanisms for assistance in these major incidents, you know, all the technical side is well-oiled, but the assistance to victims and their families is not. Because this requires coordination, not just at a national level with all the different stakeholders, but also we need a coordination with the other states involved and all their stakeholders. I'm talking here, obviously, about the coordination with the investigation authority. I think that Annex 13 should include this assistance to victims' families as well. And so we're looking at the coordination at a regional level in terms of assistance to victims' families. Thank you, Pamela.
When you refer to a regional mechanism, then probably, Mr. Judy, you could say something about it. Is this something that you conceive? Please.
Yeah, for sure. This is something
En la coordinación, ¿no? Obviamente.
Yes, in the coordination, obviously.
Regarding the coordination of support to victims that go beyond the limits of a state, but in a regional approach, is this something that it is conceived in your work?
Yeah, this is something I didn't have the time to develop during the presentation, but within Encasia we have been trying to promote this at two levels. First of all, to help each SIAs and mainly the safety investigation authorities of small European states who obviously have a smaller organization and more limited means, that first of all they should identify within their own states who are the other organizations with whom they could interact in case of a crisis, and then also obviously to develop schemes where other, within Europe, other safety investigation authorities who have maybe more experience or more means could assist those states, even if, as per the ICAO Annex 13 criteria, there is no real reason for them to be involved. So we have exercised this through tabletop exercises to show, to approach it in a more practical way. Now I can also give some examples of things where, due to the international dimension of accident investigation, we have to develop those international that international dimension in the way of providing assistance to victims. And here I will base an experience on the French BEA, where, as many of you might remember, we were in charge of the accident of the German wings, which occurred in the French Alps. One interesting feature of this accident is that the persons on board were mostly Spanish and German, and actually there was not a single French citizen on board. However, it was clear for the BA that providing information to families on where we were going and what were the result of the investigation was important. And in order to organize that and to present the result of the report, we worked a lot with our Spanish and German colleagues. And the way we set up the presentation of the report is that we organize 2 sessions in parallel at the same time, one in Barcelona, the country of departure of the flight, and one in Germany, to provide to the families, to the Spanish and the German families, information in the report. That's a practical example on how we can use international relationships. And this was possible because in the framework of ENCASIA and other cooperation, the BEA had already established a good relationship and personal relationship with their counterpart in Spain and in Germany.
Good. Well, thank you very much. But once you mentioned this in the German wings, how do you relate to families? How do you relate to the press from the accident investigation side and from the prosecutor side? Because we listen to the prosecutor. How do you interpret that? How is that dynamics? And is something that we see in other states or not? I mean, can you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, this is something, well, in a number of European states and other parts of the world, but in Europe, namely France, Germany, Spain, Italy, and others, when there is a fatal aviation accident, there is a criminal investigation being open and starting from the day of the accident. And obviously this criminal investigation is developing itself in parallel with the safety investigation. And those 2 investigations have the right and have good reason to interact with the public and with families to inform on the progress of the investigation. And so there is, ideally, there is a need for coordination of this information process. And this is why the EU regulation has asked that in each member state there is a protocol, an agreement being set up between the Safety Investigation Authority and the judicial authorities. In the case of the German wing accident, as many have seen, the prosecutor has provided information early on to the families and then to the public. So I would say the essential objective of informing in a structured way about what was known about the accident was satisfied. Now, to me, it is clear that the process of coordination of the information between the BEA and the judicial authority at that time was still, I would say, in its infancy.
Okay.
And I hope we have progress on that since that time.
Okay. Yeah, because we see double exercise from different perspectives, and that could be very difficult. In any case, Pilar, you have a question, and then I see another question. Pilar has. Pilar, probably can we go to, because I see the chairwoman of the German Wings Association. Is this correct? Okay, I see that the mic is, yes.
To Mr. Remy, so 2 questions. So in CASIA S6, so is this a division of the DBA, the French DBA? You have talked about the fair culture of the independent investigations of core and official investigations. So why did the prosecutor in Paris, in the case of German Wings, inform the families and the French there, which was directing the official investigation, allowed him to inform the families? And another question to Mrs. Homendi. So the NTSB is being a leader, is leading the investigation of accidents and the relationship with the assistance to families and victims. I would like to I would like that by so in 2011. So your former the former person in your the former chair so so promoted an international event with the families, and so now 10 years after that event, that meeting in 2011, we should have a meeting like that in order to update what the NTSB is doing in relations with the assistance to the families and the victims. So thank you very much, Pilar. Now we will listen to the following question, and we will combine both questions. Please.
So we have one question for Mr. Juti and another question for Madame Hamedi. Pending. Pending.
Buenos días. Muchas gracias.
So good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the attention that you are giving to us. Both the organization and also all the governments that have intervened. I have two questions, one for Mrs. Suarez and another for Mr. Remy. Mrs. Suarez talked about the protocols of the personal belongings of the victims. I didn't understand, or probably I didn't pay attention to the procedure that you follow, what you do with the personal belongings, whether you return them and how you return them to the people. And for Mr. Remy, I would like to thank you for the report that you carried out a very thorough work. I don't know whether some people in this auditorium know the results of this report. So one of the topics that we were worried about, and we have had no answer about this yet, is the co-pilot that voluntarily crashed the airplane had over 45 work leaves due to depression and due to the administration of different medicines in order to cure this depression. He had on sick leaves, on medical leaves, even some days before the event, and it seems that one of the doctors that attended him asked him to be hospitalized in a psychiatric hospital. So there's one section talking about the Agency of Aerospatial Medicine. This is very brief. It reads, the asthma considers that the psychological test, thorough psychological test in order to diagnose a serious mental disease as a part of the medical recognitions for the routine medical test to the pilot is not productive or profitable, so that's why this is not justified. This, to the victims of the Germanwings air crash, this is something is very worrying, very concerning, because in my opinion, according to what I have understood for the accident, so the consequences are based on recommendations and never on something that is mandatory. So this is my understanding. Probably I'm wrong, so I would like to know whether I am wrong or not. So if this is just which is not mandatory, what are the guarantees that we have that this will not happen again? Because, of course, if you recommend that the medical recognition, medical texts are not productive or profitable and they should not be mandatory, an event like this took the life of 150 people and have left many families damage. Could you please specify what you mean with your question? Will this be transformed or translated into a positive change so that, in order to prevent this from happening again? because a question. So we have talked about the investigation of air crashes and the information and the attendance. So they have to. So for this trust to be built, my point of view, we need transparency in the information. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for the question. I'm sure we can answer the question, but we are about half hour late. So we have many things to deal with. We have written down everything that we have, that I'm seeing Nancy Graham in the group, in the 5th group. We will try to deal with those elements in the 5th block. So we have a question for Mr. Chuti, 2 questions for Mr. Chuti, 1 for Mr. Homendy, and also for Pamela. Please, Mr. Chuti.
Yeah, if I have well followed, I think I have 3 questions on me, 2 from Mrs. Pilar and 1 from the lady from the German families. Mrs. Pilar, Encasia is not something created by the French BA. Encasia is something which is created by the European institution. It is created by the European regulation governing accident investigation in Europe. And it happens that I, as a director of the BA, has been elected by my peers as the chairman of this network. And by the way, my mandate will end at the end of next year, 2022. You had also a question about the relationship with the prosecutor about the German wings. Again, under the French system, and I believe it is very similar in other countries where the judicial criminal system is under the so-called civil code, or Code Napoleon, sometimes some others call it. There is no way the Safety Investigation Authority could tell the prosecutor or the investigating judge, it depends on how it is called in the various countries, what to do and how to communicate or not to communicate. So the French prosecutor was free to decide. Now, that doesn't mean we cannot do anything, and we have set up protocols with the judicial authorities which recommend that as far as possible there is a coordination between the investigation authority, so in case of France the BA, and the judicial authority, so the prosecutor in France. Now in the case of the German wings, 2 difficulties. First of all was the pace of the investigation. You have, now it looks maybe easy, but the specificity in that case is that between the retrieval of the recorders and the understanding of the event, it was only a question of hours, while in most of the time this takes days, weeks, months. And so there was a need to communicate information rather quickly, because anyway it would leak otherwise and it would be uncontrolled, and there was little time to coordinate. And the second difficulty is that the agreement between the BA and the French judicial authorities was quite early, and so, as I said, it was in its infancy. But I think we have learned from that, and I had the opportunity to discuss with the prosecutor after that, and to take the lessons, okay. And I hope we will do better in the next time.
Okay, thank you.
Regarding the question on the implementation of actions following
that's a very simple question for you.
The German wings report. So these reports contain a number of recommendations. As you pointed out, those are only recommendations and as such are not mandatory. This is not by chance, and I do not see this as a deficiency of the system. Actually, this is very important that we, independent safety investigation authorities, produced only a recommendation and not mandatory action. Because if we had the power to take mandatory action, that would mean we would be in the position of the oversight authority of our states, or even beyond that, like we would be in the US, the FAA, or in France, the DGAC, or the CA, or whatever. And thus, we would lose our capability to have an independent look at what the oversight authority is doing. So it is very important that we do not have the right to mandate action. Now, in case of the Germanwings, that doesn't mean that no action have been taken. Actually, EASA had taken some initiative even before the BA report was published and the recommendation was published. And we do not have time to develop in detail all the actions, but there have been things done in terms of profiling the pilots before they are entering an airline and doing some testings about drug and alcohol.
But basically what you're saying is that accident investigation commissions, they provide recommendations, and this is all over the world. It is not only BEA, it is all over the world, and this is the case.
And, so, it is on purpose that it is only a recommendation.
Yes, and you explain it very well that this is the case. In any case, well, then we go to NTSB. The question you organized a long time ago, an event. What are your thoughts about the future?
Yeah, what was referred to is in 2011, the NTSB organized a 2-day International Family Assistance Conference, which brought together nearly 300 attendees from 27 countries and about 120 organizations, which was wonderful. But as mentioned, we have 6 staff right now dedicated to our family assistance program and hundreds of transportation accidents cases to work on for them. And I know during COVID I had seen figures that during the pandemic they were engaging with between 1,500 and 2,000 families just over a period of a year. So that's a lot. What we prefer to do is work directly with international partners, doing joint events, outreach training. I know we had an event, a joint family assistance exercise scheduled with one country and an air carrier prior to the pandemic. We feel those are extremely beneficial and would welcome doing more of those. But our resources are limited, and we need to keep in mind that we are a response organization, but also want to help our partners and work with our partners globally to enhance family assistance, both for us and for others. So with that, you know, I would just say we're a bit limited right now for a big event.
Thank you very much. Then, Pamela, very briefly, because we have to close.
Thank you very much. Regarding the question that the Federation of Victims asked me, the reality is that our country, as most of the countries in Latin America, so when we have an air crash, a tragedy, we have on the site of the tragedy, we have the core authorities and the investigation authorities. They are the only authorities that have access. So, and so the removal of the remains out of the personal belongings, this belongs to the core authorities. So, but following what the Cambridge colleague mentioned before, it is very important for the investigation to consider the importance that it has for the victims and for the families, the care for the personal belongings. So when the investigators start to work on that, we have to identify and to suggest some protocols for the care for the objects, because sometimes the justice has not had time to remove them, and they remain with the remainders of the airplane. So we have to generate with other investigators these priorities during the process, not only for the care of the remains, but also for the care of the objects. And we have to return these elements in a standardized way, because otherwise, with the learning that we have had with the families, one of the most difficult topics is when they consulted about certain objects that were very important to them. So that was our treatment.
For questions at this point of time, I'm sorry, because we are already 35 minutes late, and we will have a problem. But those questions can be raised in probably in session 5, and to address them. I don't want to lose sight of the introduction in this session of Professor Brian White. He started talking about trust, and we continued speaking about communication. But if you don't have trust in the source, how are you going to communicate something that people are going to believe? So yes, we need to communicate to the press, we need to communicate to the families, but there has to be trust, and trust on that information. And that information is coming from, well, the accident investigation authorities, but they have to be independent. How do we define independence? And not only they have to be independent and capable, they have to have technical resources in order to be credible. I know that this is not a question in some states, but there is a question in some others. So how can you communicate if you don't have the basics? But I will leave it there. I think it was very important. It was very important also the principles that Mr. Judy mentioned: independence, credibility, just culture, public reports, etc. We listened from the experience of Malaysian Airlines. I'm sorry we couldn't have and propose some questions to Malaysian Airlines. Extremely difficult exercise, extremely difficult 2 accidents, and especially difficult for an airline that relies on information coming from others. So, and also we couldn't ask questions to our other friends from Emirates and others. So we will leave it there. We have plenty of questions without answering. Myself, I would like to continue for another couple hours here, but we cannot. So a round of applause to all the speakers at this point of time. Now we are going to have 15 minutes coffee break. Thank you. 15 minutes.